My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing the Bob Dylan biopic, A Complete Unknown, which examines the political and cultural history of the early 1960s.
I want to tell you a little story. A few months back, my friend Woody Guthrie and we met a young man. He dropped in on us out of nowhere and he played us a song. In that moment, we got a feeling we were getting a glimpse of the future.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson. Jim, did you ever cause a stir when you went electric?
It's funny you should say that, Gary, because I actually did. I got a cheap acoustic guitar for Christmas when I was 14. And by the time I was 15, I was rocking our household with a very noisy electric guitar. I just discovered it's hard to be a teenage guitar hero on an acoustic.
Okay. I personally have an acoustic guitar, and I have no dreams at all of going electric there. Okay. So, Jim, you and I have been friends for many, many years, and we've shared our thoughts about many, many musical acts. But I can't remember if we've ever talked about Bob Dylan. What is your relationship to him?
I think the best way to describe mine is on and off again. I mean, how can it really be anything different with Dylan, who's been through so many phases and genres, been around for so long, it's impossible to keep up. But one of the first records I ever bought was the single Like a Rolling Stone in 1965, which often tops the critics' list of the best song ever. Later on, I bought several albums like New Morning, Desire, Blood on the Tracks, but it comes and goes. How about you?
Well, mine is actually quite different. You know, he was not part of my musical experience growing up at all. I was too young to become aware of the events depicted in this movie, and I didn't really become seriously interested in pop music until I was 10 years old and the Beatles hit the US. So I never listened to him when I was a kid. And in my defense, there's almost no way I could have been able to discover Dylan anyway because his songs were not pop hits. You know, I looked at the Billboard charts for the first half of the 60s, and the first Dylan song that cracked the top 100 was Like a Rolling Stone in 1965. So I didn't really register him until 1969 when he released Lay Lady Lay, which is an extremely atypical Dylan song.
Yeah, if you were like I was, an AM radio influenced person in terms of pop music, you weren't going to get too much of Dylan on there. You're right. I'd say there's about 10 or 12 songs of his that I truly love. And they tend not to be the protest songs, but the more personal ones, like you mentioned, Lay Lady Lay, Knocking on Heaven's Door, his diatribe about Hurricane Carter, and especially Tangled Up in Blue. I think um, in addition to Like a Rolling Stone, Positively Fourth Street,
Yeah.
which may have been about the folk scene, also hit the charts. You know, not number one, but in the top 20. And it's just interesting that the two hits, so to speak, that he had early on in '65 had nothing to do with social issues or
Right.
protest. They were just personal vitriol against someone or something. So it's kind of interesting, his relationship with his fandom.
Yeah, well, we can talk about the politics later because that's actually a major a part of the movie. I will say that it wasn't until I got to college even that I discovered that some people really love Dylan in a major way, and I started to realize how important he was. But by then, I kind of felt like it was too late to catch up, which of course now seems ridiculous. You know, like 1972, I can't go back, and I never caught on. I never even owned a Bob Dylan record in my life. And I didn't have
Yeah.
any Bob Dylan music in my house until I got married. And my wife brought a copy of Blood on the Tracks with her, and now it's marital property. But but we had friends over at the house last weekend, and I pulled out the album, and I think it's the first time it had been played in the house since we got married. So
Yeah, that is a great album, but it seems to me that respect and admiration rather than love and obsession describe the typical Dylan fan. He's intriguing, he's inaccessible, and as we see in this film, not altogether likable. So it's hard to be a Dylan fan in the way that someone might be a fan of another pop act. You know, there's been some recent modern day concerts where he basically kept his back to the audience the entire concert and uttered not a single word of onstage banter. So he's not an easy guy to be
Right.
sort of a fan of, much less a teeny bopper fan like when we were growing up as teenagers.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about the movie is that it really made me think about Bob Dylan for the first time in my entire life, really. And I find like I really regret that I missed out on all this stuff because a lot of these songs I really do like. I mean, I love Ain't Me Babe, It Ain't Me Babe, Like a Rolling Stone, Forever Young, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Shelter from the Storm, Simple Twist of Fate. I mean, I love all those songs, and I never really put it together that I should probably like Bob Dylan too.
Yeah.
All right, so we're here to talk about the movie, and I think it's your turn to summarize. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Here we go. A Complete Unknown is the 2024 biographical drama about a young Bob Dylan. It's based on a book called Dylan Goes Electric by Elijah Wald. Came out in 2015. And by the way, Mr. Dylan recommends we all read the book after we see the movie. It's the movie stars Timothy Chalamet as Dylan, Edward Norton as his mentor, Pete Seeger, and two key women are portrayed. Joan Baez, played by Monica Barbaro, and Sylvie Russo is played by Ellie Fanning. The film covers the specific time period of 61 to 65 and chronicles Dylan's arrival in New York, meeting his folk hero Woody Guthrie, being taken under the wing and promoted by folk singer Pete Seeger. He falls in love and moves in with Sylvie while simultaneously conducting an on and off again affair with Joan Baez, while also hitting it big in the Greenwich Village music scene, snags a recording contract with Columbia Records. But Dylan is uncomfortable with staying in the narrow acoustic folk music lane and uncomfortable with the trappings of fame. As he moves from acoustic songs to electric instrumentation, he faces rancor and charges of betrayal from the rather cult-like folk purists. The film climaxes in the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, which descends into chaos as Dylan insists on blasting out his new rock-oriented tunes, while at least some in the audience break out in boos and cause a near riot. Interwoven with Dylan's personal journey are some of the time-stamped issues of the early 60s, JFK, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination, the civil rights struggles, the burgeoning protest movement. In the end, we are left with a portrait of Dylan that is elusive and mysterious from the beginning of the film to the end, probably just as the real Bob Dylan likes it and wants it.
All right, I think that's a very comprehensive review of the movie. And I know this is a podcast about presidents on film. So you already kind of mentioned it, but I want to reemphasize that a president does appear in this movie twice. We see JFK delivering a speech about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we see Walter Cronkite announcing that JFK has been killed. So these are just flashes, but I think we're justified in discussing this because it's more sneakily political than many of the movies that are explicitly about the presidents.
Yeah, I think it is totally in our jurisdiction. It covers a truly transitional period in political and social history, the early 60s. Kennedy was a bridge between many of the verities of the past and the upheavals and breakdowns of the later 60s. And when he was killed, that bridge was blown up. Change became chaotic rather than managed. So we see this and also in the transition from folk to rock music and from pretty generic protest songs about how peace is good and war is bad to the much angrier and vicious up against the wall rock later on. Personally, I find the early 60s to be kind of a sweet spot between the stodgy 50s and the later nihilistic 60s. It's too bad we can't freeze in time that period covered by this movie.
Well, we both were growing up. I mean, we're just kids then, and there is a tendency to look back on those years with special fondness. But yeah, I mean, those were great years for America, even though we were as at each other's throats almost as much then as we are now. So,
Mm-hmm.
all right, let me talk about the reception of the movie. A Complete Unknown was well received by the critics. On Rotten Tomatoes, it received an 81% rating among critics and 96% among the general public. It was the 39th most popular movie release last year, generating 74 million in the domestic box office and 115 million globally. This compares to the number one movie of last year, Inside Out 2, which brought in $1.7 billion. The other top movies of the year were Deadpool and Wolverine, Moana 2, Despicable Me 4, and Wicked 1. It doesn't sound 74 million doesn't sound that impressive compared to Inside Out 2. But another way to look at it is that it generated more revenue than the combined ticket sales from these other Oscar rated movies, which are Anora, The Brutalist, Real Pain, Nickel Boys, and Amelia Perez. Better than all of them combined. So it's one of these rare Oscar nominees that is both critical and popular appeal.
And
So,
what did that do for it at the ceremony?
well, yes. It received 8 Academy Award nominations. Unfortunately, it was shut out. And the biggest impact it had at the movies was that Timothée Chalamet, who was wearing this ridiculously lemon yellow tuxedo, and was sitting there right in the front row, and certainly stood out.
Well, isn't Chalamet French for parakeet or?
Oh, is it? I don't know.
No, it isn't. I'm just joking.
Oh, it isn't. All right, all right.
But I wanted to. So you surely watched the Oscars show, which was, as we're taping this, just a few days ago,
Right.
and I surely didn't.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, what did you think of the Oscar ceremonies this year?
Well, I thought the Oscar ceremony was pretty good. I like Conan O'Brien did a great job. They mostly stayed away from politics, except for a couple of jokes, one joke and one not joke. But it was So I thought it was good, and it was funnier than usual. In fact, one of the best jokes was about Dylan himself. When Mick Jagger came out to present for the best song, he said, I'm quoting here. I wasn't the first choice to give this award out. The producers really wanted Bob Dylan to do this. Bob didn't want to do it because he said the best songs this year were obviously in the movie A Complete Unknown, which is totally true. I mean, those other songs were preposterously bad compared to the songs that are in A Complete Unknown. And he said, Bob said you should find someone younger. I said, okay, I'm younger. I'm younger than Bob. I'll do it. So here I am.
He's like 1 year younger, right?
Yeah. He looks like he's a million years older.
Yeah, they're both. Well, what amazed me about the Oscars, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, is how low the ratings have gotten.
Yeah.
I read some of the early reports, and it's like it used to be a Super Bowl type event worldwide. And I read that, like, in that so-called ideal demo that advertisers want to see, they had like 3 million viewers in the demo, which is like Fox News on a typical night on cable. And that's remarkable crumbling of an audience.
Well, Fox News definitely does not have 3 million in that demo. They are
not in the demo, but
they are famously 55 plus audience.
They all are. All the cable news are.
But well, I mean, I personally loved Anora, which is the best picture this year, but it's the lowest box office for any best picture winner ever. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do about it, but people aren't going to the movies anymore. Anyway, so Jim, who would you recommend this movie to?
Well, obviously Dylan fans, folk music fans, 60s nostalgists. And I think that those who have been following the meteoric rise of Timothée Chalamet and are fans of his, and I suspect, and this is a blast out of the past, that his name alone might have drawn some younger people to the movie theaters.
Yeah, you might be right about that, although he was not enough of an attraction to get my son to go. I would also say that people who want to know what it was like in pre-hippie America should watch this. This is the yin to the yang of Unfrosted, the Jerry Seinfeld movie we watched earlier. Those two movies could not be more different, but they both betray a deep yearning for the more innocent 1960s.
Yeah, when we were watching Mad Men on
Yeah,
TV, and Mad Men covered the transition from the pre-assassination to post-assassination, you could really feel it there too.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, the change in the decade.
So what did you like about the movie?
Well, it was great to hear some of the old songs and
Mhm.
to see them performed. It was great to see sort of a reenactment of the early 60s and what it was like in Greenwich Village and the folk music scene. I sat there thinking what a stimulating feeling it must have been to be young and full of artistic pretense and participating in the vibrant cafe scene there. And I thought about what I thought of was it being somewhat akin to the 1920s in Paris,
Mhm.
especially when we were young. Many of us imagined that we could have picked up a pad and a pencil and become another Hemingway in Paris, just as I'm sure many wanted to fantasize about picking up a guitar and going off to the village, becoming another Dylan. So I really liked how the movie evoked that spirit.
Yeah, I actually felt a major feelings of nostalgia wash over me when I was watching this. And it's weird that I'm nostalgic for a period that I didn't even experience. When I first saw the trailer for the movie, I almost burst into tears because it seemed like they had recreated Greenwich Village that I'd missed out on. You know, Greenwich Village still looks like it did a lot like it did in 1961, but this was actually filmed in Hoboken, which looks lot more like the old Greenwich Village than Greenwich Village itself did.
Yeah.
I also liked that there was an honest portrait of Dylan, who was arrogant, insecure, and selfish, in addition to being a major talent. You know, I understand that the director, James Mangold, showed him the script ahead of time and he signed off on it and even suggested a scene that made him look like more of a jerk. So it's to Dylan's credit that they didn't insist that they sugarcoat anything.
Yeah, Dylan, I have the quote here of what Dylan said
Yeah.
about the movie. This was before its official release. He said, "There's a movie about me opening up soon called A Complete Unknown. What a title! Timothy Chalamet is starring in the lead role. Timothy is a brilliant actor, so I'm sure he's going to be completely believable as me, or a younger me, or some other me." And he goes on to praise the book and says we should read the book as well as see the movie because of the way it describes the quote unquote fiasco at Newport.
Yeah, and I have to say that I was one other thing I liked about the movie is that it really filled a gap in my education on the history of music. I mean, I never really understood the role of folk music before, and after watching this movie, I was inspired to go back and do some research into the movement, and like I've been really doing a deep dive in this stuff ever since.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
slow, I mean, trying to catch up, but I know I never will.
yeah.
Anything you didn't like about the movie?
Well, you referenced it, and it's not really the movie, but I didn't particularly like Bob Dylan. Not
Okay.
not the performance, but the person. He's kind of an ass. I don't think on the movies front, I don't think the movie really unlocked any solution to the riddle of who is Bob Dylan. He was a complete unknown when he arrived in New York all those years ago, and he's kind of a complete unknown today. George Harrison wrote a song about Dylan that was on the All Things Must Pass album. It's called Behind That Locked Door, and in which Harrison describes how impenetrable Dylan can be. And I have to think, I think this is also an image that Dylan cultivated
Right.
over the years and liked, a man of mystery. It's kind of an egocentrism to want everyone to pore over your every word and clue and all that, try to figure out what makes you tick. You know, people like him, like people to be absorbed in him. Just the opposite of John Lennon, by the way, who let it all hang out, literally on one of his album covers, but artistically, in terms of his feelings and emotions. And Dylan was the polar opposite of that. And I think he cultivated that. So that kind of bugged me that I didn't go in and get the magic answer.
Well, you should have expected it in that title, right? A complete
Yeah.
unknown. I mean, he is unknown, and I think that's the point of the movie. It's funny you talk about John Lennon because I think John Lennon was kind of obsessed with Dylan, you know.
Well,
Uh,
it's interesting. He was the first of the Beatles to really glob onto him. I think because he was a word guy mainly, like Dylan, and he was the first to imitate him. And then the relationship, such as it was, turned a little more problematic. He started calling Dylan Zimmerman,
right,
which was Dylan's real name. The relationship eventually between George Harrison and Dylan was genuine and much closer, almost a brotherhood. And they ended up being bandmates together in the
right,
Traveling Wilburys.
right,
So
right.
yeah, I think there was ebbs and flows with Dylan and Lennon, but it was really a true friendship with Harrison.
Well, and there's also that song "Dig It." You know, it's got this line in there like a Rolling Stone,
Right.
and it's like I almost have a hard time singing or remembering what this real song a Rolling Stone is like because I kept hearing this snarky way that John Lennon's talking about it.
Which is too
um
bad.
I liked almost everything in the movie. I have a feeling we're going to get here where I liked it better than you, but the one thing I didn't like, and I was going to bring it up in discussion where we talk about historical accuracy, but I'm going to mention it here too. The movie really whitewashed Pete Seeger. The movie starts out with several quick political references, including Pete Seeger being sentenced for refusing to answer questions before the House on Activities Committee. But then it goes pretty blank on the overt political references. You would never know from watching this movie that Pete Seeger is a former communist. I mean, he left the Communist Party in 1949, but continued to defend Stalin well into the late 1960s. So
Yeah.
communism betrays a moral failing as significant as supporting fascism before the Nazis began World War II. And I think it calls into question about why he's pressuring Dylan to be a folk purist. And he's also a weasel. I mean, I did a lot of YouTubing after this movie,
Yeah.
and I watched an interview in which he denied being a communist. And
Yeah.
technically, he was not then a communist, but he was a communist before. So,
Well, but so I'm gonna cut him a little slack. I mean, I don't have any, not carrying any brief for him, but I happen to think he wrote better protest songs than Dylan. Turn, Turn, Turn is a great song. If
mhm,
I Had a Hammer, Where Have All the Flowers Gone?
right.
So he wrote some great songs. He was not alone in being a fellow traveler in the entertainment and Hollywood, set in the from the late 30s on. But that is a rap that he got. And I remember he actually came to Glens Falls, New York, my hometown,
Okay.
to do a concert in the mid 60s. And shows that this kind of folk music was really the music of the proletariat. In other words, they they got on buses and went around places that acts usually wouldn't go. I mean, I actually saw the association in my junior high school, because they were on a bus tour of upstate New York. But I saw that Pete Seeger was coming, and I sort of was interested, but my mother shut it down quickly, saying, "No, he's a communist." So there you go, Gary.
Too bad I didn't know your mother any better than I did. Um, he but he's also, as I said, a little bit of a liar. I mean, because he says that the only reason he eventually came to claim that the only reason he was upset about Newport is because the sound was so loud and distorted. But I just don't believe that. I mean, everyone who was there said that was the angriest they'd ever seen Pete Seeger, and I have it hard to believe that you become so enraged over someone else's audio distortion.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another thing I didn't like about the movie, or I thought story was confusing and repetitive at times. It settled into this pattern of here's a song, and then here's another conversation with Bob and Woody, Bob and Seeger, Bob and his record company, Bob and one of his girlfriends, then another song, et cetera. It's just sort of, I thought it got a little monotonous. And, we had to see Sylvie standing in the wings at concert where she's breaking into tears because she realizes she's losing Bob and maybe losing him to Joan Baez. We have to see that twice, not
Right.
once, and I said, enough already. And then the other thing, and this I don't challenge the historical accuracy, but it's the whole issue of the transition from folk to rock, from acoustic to electric, seems to us to be, or to me, to be a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, all genres are mixed today. There's so much crossover in popular entertainment now. And the movie sort of made a big deal about that. And maybe it was. But then if they're going to focus on that, why not focus on what else was going on in the folk rock movement? There was huge acts that would have done their thing regardless of whether Dylan gave them permission or not. I mentioned the Association, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds. There's a lot of acts, and that also the movie also didn't cover at all the transition that was going on from New York to Los Angeles and San Francisco in the music scene. So I thought that in general, I would say if I had a complaint, the vision was too narrow, the focus, even on the issue of the transition of music, focus was too narrow, and it didn't really link up the cultural changes with the musical changes, except to show that both were happening at the same time.
Well, I think it did sort of remind me that the cultural changes that you're talking about didn't really take place until after the movie ends. I mean, the hippies didn't, people were still dressed like, basic 1950s types up until 1966 or 67 when the hippies really came in. So,
Yeah.
anything else you didn't like?
No, that pretty much covers it.
Okay. So what do you think the movie's trying to accomplish?
Well, it's trying to show a pivotal chapter in Dylan's life and his career and the changes that were going on in both society and popular music. I think that's pretty straightforward. What's interesting to me is that there was another film already made about this precise time period. Martin Scorsese did No Direction Home, which was a documentary in 2005 covering the precise same period and set of changes. Now, I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have,
No, I haven't.
but it's kind of strange that they would go to trot upon the same ground. I know this was a dramatic portrayal, not a documentary, but how about other periods in Dylan's life? And it's also interesting that they, for both titles, drew from the same song, phrases from the same song, because Scorsese's No Direction Home, that's a phrase that also comes from the song Like a Rolling Stone.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think what it's trying to do is interrogate the role of music in the pursuit of social justice. I mean, almost everyone in the movie except Dylan believes that music can change the world. And you and I both lived through the 60s when that was taken as an article of faith. But Dylan comes to believe that music should not be didactic and message oriented, and the movie seems to come down on his side. James Mangold seems to have applied the same principle to the movie because this is not a message movie. He doesn't hammer you over the head with his theme, and like all good works of art, you can come to many different conclusions after watching it. So,
What do you think of him as a director? Have you seen other of his films?
well, I saw, he did this movie, I Walk the Line, starring, which is
Yeah.
a biopic about Johnny Cash. That movie basically covers a much bigger period in Johnny Cash's life. I think he's good. I mean, I don't think it is remarkable cinematic technique, but he seems to weave everything together pretty fine. And that's the only movie of his that I've seen, I think. But he's fine. I was not bored. The thing about Sylvie looking sad twice backstage, I agree that we could have done without that the second time, especially since that's didn't even happen. But
He
Um,
seems like the director seems like a jack of all trades kind of
yeah.
director. He's done biopics, he's done action. Just coincidentally, I saw the film Copland from 1997, um, which was about a group of corrupt New York City police officers. And I only found out after the fact when looking him up for this movie that he directed that too. So it seems like he's done westerns. I mean, he's done everything. So
Yeah.
good journeyman director.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, all right, let's talk about the actors. So let's talk about Timothy Chalamet. By the way, apparently people call him Timmy. This is I did not know. I listened to a James Mangold interview on Fresh Air or something, and it was Timmy this and Timmy that. So
Hmm. Well, I've gone on the theory that the extra E at the end of his first name has helped his career
maybe.
because you when you have some idiosyncrasy, it's like we're talking about Susan Weaver versus Sigourney Weaver. You've just got some little twist that gets you a little more noticed. So that's my theory of the day.
What do you
But
think
the
about
extra E, surprise, surprise, I thought he was good because
okay,
I never was a particular fan. I thought he was, and I worried because I thought he was too androgynous, too scrawny, not masculine enough. I mean, Dylan wasn't a he-man, but when you listen to songs like Rainy Day Women, where he's the typical guy in a beer joint, grousing about women making his life miserable, he ain't no modern sensibility, at least back then. But I thought he was really good, and it was really impressive to me that he's in a relatively long line of actors and biopics that perform the songs.
right,
He performed the songs just like Sissy Spacek performed them in Coal Miner's Daughter. The stars of the Elton John and Ray Charles biopics also sang the songs. I think that was true, and I Walk the Line. I'm not sure. I didn't see it. It's always more impressive. Extra credit for that to him and those
right,
others.
right. Yeah, I have to admit that I laughed when I heard that he was playing Dylan because I always thought of him as a pretty boy lightweight. And you're right, he is very androgynous. But he turned out to be believable. And, he's probably the most popular actor of his generation. He's been a major celebrity and teen heartthrob for over a decade. And I've actually seen him in a lot of movies, and I've always thought, hmm, he's the star of Dune, for example.
Yeah,
I thought the Dylan voice sounded more authentic sometimes rather than others. I was also impressed. You said he was scrawny, and when he took his shirt off, you could see that he's not built up at all. But I think that was probably the physique of a 19-year-old Bob Dylan, at that time.
yeah,
There was not back then, whenever you see people without their shirts on, you're always surprised at how little attention they paid to their bodies, the men there, that is.
yeah. The amazing thing is this movie apparently had been floating around for 4 or 5 years before it got made, and with Chalamet as the star for four
Oh
or five
yeah,
years.
no, he
So
was. It was delayed because of COVID,
yeah,
and so he spent these 4 years learning how to sing like Dylan, play the guitar, play the harmonica. It
but
was
if there
probably
was a note of concern that he might be too young and soft to play Dylan now, imagine 5 years ago. That's the amazing thing.
well. The thing is, we think about it, but if you ever see any videos of Dylan back in those days, I mean, he was 19 years old. He was 20 years
Yeah,
old. I mean, when you see these videos, he's like, oh my God, I can't believe how young he was.
yeah,
So in a way, he's a little old for the part. But I'm with you. I mean, I don't think people would have no recollection of Dylan as a young person. Because he seems like such a grizzled old. He's always looked like a grizzled old.
well, he's 83 years old now. So.
Yeah. Of course, he did not win for his Academy Award. He lost it to Adam Brody and Adrian Brody, rather,
Yeah.
in The Brutalist. I'm also going to note that he was sitting there in the front row with his billionaire girlfriend, Kylie Jenner. So I don't know, he's got some appeal. If he can attract Kardashian adjacent billionaire. All right, what about Ed Norton as Pete Seeger?
Well, putting aside the facts of Pete Seeger, um, which you've already laid out, I thought it was the best job in the movie. I thought he made, I think this was how the part was written, your protest noted, but it made him sympathetic, complex, betrayed by Dylan, but couldn't really bring himself to hate Dylan, even after the quote unquote betrayal. And I thought that it's another kudo to Norton, who is incredibly versatile in the
Yeah.
parts and the roles that he plays. He's played everything from a neo-Nazi to Nelson Rockefeller in movies. So I just thought I really liked this part. I really liked the portrayal. Again, putting the reality aside for a
I
minute.
think again, I hate to talk about YouTube so much, but I did watch him introducing Bob Dylan at the 1964 Folk Festival, and Edward Norton sounded just like him. I mean,
Mm.
he plays Seeger as a nice, soft-spoken, naive almost. He's got this Midwestern, like a Midwestern innocent of some kind, almost a goober. There's a scene where he's playing "The Lion Sleeps Tonight," and he has the audience singing "a wee da wa, a wee da wa, a wee da wa, a wee da wa," and all I could think of was like how corny that was. But then I had to think, but anyone who could justify Stalin's genocides isn't innocent. So but I did what I did learn about this movie from the Pete Seeger stuff is that the folk revival of the mid 20th century was a political movement. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I used to just think that it was people with corny tastes. I didn't realize there was a political element to it. And apparently, Pete Seeger is the last in a long line of intellectuals who thought that if they could just capture the songs of the real people who sang without any adornment or bells and whistles, they could unite the working class. And this is a movement that goes way back to the Grimm's brothers in Germany, who collected folk tales and published the Grimm's fairy tales. And then when portable recording machines were invented in this century, the communist countries, they would send either social scientists into the countryside to record local folk songs. So,
Yeah.
and to be honest with you, I don't believe the proletariat really cares about folk music at all. I mean, we know very well that they like the Beatles a lot more than they like Peter, Paul, and Mary.
But what's interesting is what happened to some of those the folk music, because I mentioned some of Pete Seeger's songs, which I happen to think are really good songs, like "Turn, Turn, Turn," which the Byrds made a
Right,
big hit out of,
right,
and "Where Have All the Flowers Gone,"
right.
which is so anodyne. It's not salt of the earth. It's a nice, poetic Hallmark greeting card kind of message. And by the way, if anyone wants to see a really interesting depiction of Where Have All the Flowers Gone, go to YouTube and search for Marlene Dietrich performing it at the Royal Command Performance in London in the early 60s. That's the performance where the Beatles famously performed at the beginning of their fame. She does a great job. And of course, she knew all about war,
Yeah.
all
Oh,
her
yeah.
family in Germany, and she was on the good guy's side and risked her life to go behind, right up to the front lines to perform. But these are songs that I can't object to, whereas if they were really the salt of the earth, socialist kind of labor union hero kind of songs, maybe I would. But who can object to Where Have All the Flowers Gone?
Well, I think that's kind of a sappy song. Maybe
Yeah,
because I've heard
that's my
it's.
point.
I know it's like I object to it on aesthetic terms, not political terms. What about Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez?
I thought she was very good likeness and imitation. Joan Baez is an interesting figure in the
Yeah,
history of the times. She was a far leftist who later on had the temerity to say that she and others were too naive about what would happen if the communists took over Vietnam and Cambodia. And what did she get for her honesty? Nothing but scorn from her fellow leftists and accusations of being a traitor. But I thought she played the part well. I've only bought one Joan Baez album in my life, and it was in the toward the tail end of our college years in the mid '70s, and it was the Diamond and Rust album.
Yeah.
Diamonds and Rust, by the way, is a beautiful song. It's
Yeah.
about Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
and that whole album is very good. But I thought Barbero, who was also nominated, right, for an Oscar,
Yeah.
well, she did a very good job. What did you think?
Yeah, I thought she was great too. She had a pretty big part in as a pilot in the movie Top Gun,
Mm.
Top Gun Maverick.
Oh yeah,
But she was still relatively unknown until she played Joan Baez. It's funny how you're in a major, gigantic movie and you can sort of just fade into the background. But in this movie, she was great. And she was incredibly beautiful, more beautiful than Joan Baez, who has a more kind of a severe beauty.
yeah.
But she was the only character in the movie who could call Dylan on his BS. And again, the movie kind of plays down her activism. When we were growing up, I always thought of her as an activist who played a few songs. I never really thought of her as as an artist of her own.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I didn't know she was had already achieved some fame and notoriety, earlier than Dylan. I didn't
yeah, no,
realize that.
I had no idea that she was a big star in the early 60s on the cover of Time magazine, and that she basically made Dylan who he is by bringing him on tour with him. So, and I do have like you. I mean, I have a fair amount of respect for her though, because at least she apologized when she was wrong about, and that was not. I mean, it didn't take her as long as it took Pete Seeger to kind of quasi apologize for Stalin. I mean, it was like in the 70s when she anyway.
And what did it get her?
Where did it get her? Yeah.
Yeah.
Elle Fanning was Dylan's girlfriend. She's based on a real person, Susie Rotolo, who was Dylan's girlfriend when he became popular. What do you think?
Just okay. I mean, she wasn't playing a musician, so she didn't have as much to do as the other lead characters and couldn't show the same range. It's interesting that Dylan asked for and received a name change.
Yeah.
Um, and even though she had already died by the time this movie was being made, maybe it was her family or whatever. But yeah, her name was different in the movie than in real life.
Yeah, it was still so her real name is Susie Rotolo and she played Sylvie
Sylvie Russo.
Russo, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why. It's kind of interesting that of all the things Dylan could have asked
Yeah.
for, that was it. By the way, speaking of all communists,
Speaking
she was a communist too.
oh, I know.
Members, yeah.
I mean, I listened to this. Yes. Again, I can't believe the amount of research I've done on this movie. I listened to some interviews she did on Fresh Air, and yeah, she was only 17. I mean, I'm surprised Dylan didn't get arrested for child.
Who knows what the age was then?
Yeah, but the age of consent, yeah. So she was 17 and her parents were totally communists. And I mean, you see it in the movie that she kind of was pushing him to be involved in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
The thing about it is I thought, this is a pretty thankless playing the girlfriend in any movie is kind of a thankless role. And she's fine. But she was 17.
Dylan was 20, I
Dylan
think.
was 19 when they met. So this romance is really an example of young first love. I mean, she doesn't look 17, and if we had known they were teenagers, we would have looked at this breakup, in a little bit of a different way because of course teenagers break up. They break up all the time.
But she
Uh,
got herself on an album cover.
yeah, she
She
can, and she's
so
famous. I mean, she wouldn't have been
yeah.
famous otherwise. But I listened to this interview with her on Fresh Air, and she says the reason they broke up after she returned, and she was away for 6 months, not the 6 weeks that's implied in this movie.
Which at that age in a relationship is
I
a
know.
death
I mean,
knell.
but it wasn't that she was jealous of Joan Baez. It's just that she came back and she was a painter and he was a folk person and she didn't really have a role in his life. So
Yeah.
What else? You got anyone else you want to talk about?
No, I think that covers it.
All right, so let's turn to the history. I thought this movie did have some Hollywood touches that make it a more interesting story. I mean, Dylan did seek out Woody Guthrie, but Pete Seeger wasn't there when they met. His girlfriend Susie Rotolo and Johnny Cash were not at the Newport Festival in 1965. Joan Baez didn't fall into Dylan's arms because she was afraid of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Woody Guthrie didn't give Dylan a harmonica and didn't refuse it when he tried to give it back. So, but I think a lot of it was true. He was famously elusive and self-inventing. Pete Seeger really did help his career and then tried to keep him in the folk music box. Susie Rotolo, Joan Baez, and Pete Seeger pushed him to become politically active, and he was for a couple of years, including appearing at the March on Washington in 1963. But he did give that up. He and Johnny Cash really were pen pals, and that was really initiated by Johnny Cash.
Mm. Well, what about the larger issues historically, like this is Kennedy, for example,
Yeah.
Dylan and Kennedy. Um, what's your sense of how the movie played that?
Well, as I said, I thought that they overplayed the Cuban Missile Crisis part. You see people
Getting in
watching,
their cars and racing
getting in their
away.
cars and
Did that
racing away, and you got
happen?
Joan Baez running down, and she's trying to catch a cab, and it's like there's a hurricane coming or something. So I don't think it. I thought that was overplaying it. I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, they were trying to tie it to the times, and this is how you can tell historically when things are going. I mean, we know that the Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962, so when this happens, it's 1962.
But I don't think Dylan's feelings about Kennedy were very deeply explored, which I thought was too bad. He's just sort of lounging around and watching events unfold on TV without any explanation of how he really felt. Did it motivate him artistically, politically? And then, of course, speaking of whitewashes, what was really whitewashed is a very famous incident that happened in December after the assassination, when Dylan was going to a civil liberties awards committee dinner to receive an award, and he showed up drunk, and he got into the ceremony and said, "There's a little bit of Oswald in me," and people started booing, and he had to be escorted off the stage and out of the room. And none of this, this was what was going on partially in Dylan's life at the time, and it's just sort of left out. And in fact, there were interviews near that time. Dylan didn't apologize for that, but he tried to clarify what he meant.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty typical liberal kind of comment. We're all guilty. We're all,
Yeah. Right.
But he was asked about Kennedy, and he said he can't say that he was particularly gutted. He felt rotten like everybody else. It didn't knock the wind out of me. So he wasn't particularly impacted like we've been told, that the rest of the country was. And in fact, it took all the way till 2020 for him to finally record a deep dive into his reactions to Kennedy with the Murder Most Foul
Right.
spoken word record of 17 minutes long, which is very, very interesting. And I recommend it to anybody, but it's not particularly coherent. It's not hugely conspiratorial. There's some references to they killed him, but it's no Oliver Stone there. But anyway, I just thought that was a strange gap in a movie that was supposed to be diving into this period in the history and in Dylan's life.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what happened in Newport, because that's kind of the main focus of everything's leading up to the Newport Jazz Festival in 1965. What's your take on how accurate that was, or do you even have?
I don't really know, because I've seen all different interpretations.
Yeah.
It was part of the audience. It was all of the audience. So it's part of the mountain out of a molehill thing that I mentioned before. I don't care.
think so. Again, give it back to YouTube. you can watch the actual performances on YouTube. And first of all, Dylan was not the closing act. It wasn't during the day, it was at night. And he was booed. I mean, you can hear some booing, but not as viciously as shown here. And no one was throwing things on the stage. So when he does play Maggie's Farm, it is a very dramatically different change of pace. I mean, that's a very aggressively electric song. But to continue the point I was making about Pete Seeger, the main objection to the way Dylan was transforming wasn't that he had an electric guitar in his hands. It was that he was abandoning these political songs. Pete says something very snotty to him about he doesn't need to try and be the Beatles, but they sang about love and emotion, definitely not about social justice issues. And it's a little bit ironic that as Dylan became less political, the Beatles became more political.
The whole Beatles Dylan relationship was left out basically of the movie. It was again during this same period that he had the famous meeting with them in New York City in '64 while they were on their tour, and where he showed up and said, "So, are we going to do some marijuana?" And they said they never had. And he said, "Well, what about your song where you say, 'I get high, and I want to hold your hand'?" And John, apparently his face turned all red. He said, "No, I'm saying I can't hide." And, Dylan, well, why would you want to hide? You're from a girl. But anyway, so then they rolled joints and had their first tokes. And they all got stoned. So that's all left out. I think the Beatles Dylan relationship was much more compatible than, say, Elvis and the Beatles, where Elvis was really felt threatened.
Well, yeah, that was not a very successful
Right.
relationship, but
Yeah.
yeah. One more thing about Newport, if I can make a highbrow comparison, this made me think about the 1913 premiere of Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring in Paris, which was a near riot
Mm.
because it was the first time most ballet fans had ever heard modern music. And I used to think how ridiculous it was to have a riot at a ballet, but it's not more crazy than having a meltdown because someone played an electric guitar at Newport.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm not suggesting it wasn't important to people there and in that time. And I know the folk music purists, and were very, very much into their thing. It's hard for me to take so seriously this transition, because it was going on all over the country, as I mentioned, with other acts, and because today we're so used to crossover. I mean, there's hip hop and pop songs, there's country music and rock songs. I mean, everything is crossed.
Well, there were other electric music being played. Dylan was not the only one who was playing electric music at the festival. There were other
Yeah,
acts there. Again, the issue isn't the electric, it's the lack of politics. I mean, his
yeah,
switch away from politics. I mean, he was at the March on Washington in 1963, the civil rights, and he performed on national-wide TV. He was very political, and he was not having it anymore. And I think that's why Pete Seeger was so upset, because he was their main attraction. He was so popular, and he was the one that signified, and you see it in the movie. I mean, Pete Seeger's in the hotel room begging him to, like, please, just one more time. We're almost there. We've almost got it. And you can help us bring this together. And, you know,
yeah.
all right. Well, let's talk about favorite scenes. What were your favorite scenes?
Well, I liked the when Dylan was performing "The Times They Are a Changing."
Uh-huh.
I like how that infected the audience to the point where they started shouting out the tagline, after every verse. I just, I thought I got caught up in that. I thought that was good. I like that one.
Yeah, I liked all the musical scenes pretty much when they were performing. I particularly liked it when Dylan and Baez were playing "It Ain't Me, Babe."
Yeah, that was one of mine too.
Again, if you go and look at the performance in real life, the movie performance is much better than the actual performance at Newport. I mean, there's so much life and vitality when the two of them are singing together. In what happens in real life is that Joan Baez kind of begs him to come out, and they talk, and then they sing it, but it's not anywhere near as exciting as in this movie.
You have to sort of wonder in a way if these musical biopics don't take some of the mystique off of some of our favorite musical stars.
Yeah.
Because if an actor, good actor, can seemingly, after a couple years or a few months of study, whether it's Sissy Spacek or Timothy Chalamet, come in and perform all the songs to such a degree that they're totally believable as the originals. And what does that say? I'm wondering. I don't have an answer to that. I'm just wondering.
I also thought the Newport Jazz Festival, as Hollywoodized as it was actually kind of thrilling, very dramatic. This will
Yeah.
he or won't he? Even though we know the outcome, and even though that wasn't what it was like, because obviously there wasn't some sort of last minute decision. I mean, everyone knew ahead of time what he was going to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I
um,
like the scene. I liked almost every scene with Edward Norton in it, just because I liked watching him.
mhm.
Especially when he's sort of conveying his feelings, his reaction shots when he's watching Dylan ride off on the motorcycle. I
Yeah,
thought it was good stuff.
yeah. I like the scene where Bob Dylan walks out of the subway is on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, just in the very beginning of the movie. And again, that really hit me like it really does feel like you're back in 1961.
Yeah.
Any other favorite
Uh,
scenes?
Not scenes, no.
Okay, let's go to lines.
I thought when Seeger said a really good song gets the job done without frills
Right.
was good. And by the way, that's a line that electrified rock singers could enunciate as well. I mean, that was the whole point of the Beatles Get Back project. Let's get rid of the frills and the studio tricks. I thought that struck a lot of the theme of the movie, that line.
Yeah. 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 Um, so I downloaded the script and read it because I was did such a lousy job trying to take notes in the
In a
um
darkened movie
And I have
theater.
to tell you, I mean, some movies we struggle to find, like in Young Mr. Lincoln, I couldn't find hardly anything that I liked well enough to quote. And it was like line after line after line. When Bob tells Joan Baez that she tries too hard when she's writing songs, and then he says, "Sunsets and seagulls, your songs are kind of like an oil painting at the dentist's office." And what did she say? "You're kind of an asshole, Bob." The thing is, he was right. She actually did not know how to write music,
In the Diamonds and Rust
except
song,
for
she
that.
she she
That
references that as my poetry was lousy, you said,
she was
So,
right.
yeah.
He was right. Yeah.
Yeah. I liked when I think it was her that said, anyone who holds attention on a stage has to be a freak.
Yeah.
It's just you have to have that performance quality to you.
Yeah. Bob,
That's
he says that. He
not a
says,
normal person. Does he
yeah.
say that?
Yeah. He
Yeah,
said it. Yeah.
yeah.
Bob Dylan, when he's asked how he learned to play, he claims he was in a carnival, and this is when he's at Joan Baez's apartment, and he says, "Oh yeah, there was singing cowboys that came through to teach me all sorts of funny chords. They'd pass through doing shows in Kansas or Dakotas. Those chords I learned from a cowboy named Wigglefoot." And Joan Baez says, "You're in a carnival?" And then she pauses and she says, "You're so completely full of shit." I mean, she really was the only one that really had his number.
Yeah, yeah.
When they are watching the Betty Davis movie, Now Voyager, which is about a mousy spinster who becomes a sophisticated heartbreaker, Sylvie says that the Betty Davis character found herself, and he says she didn't find herself like herself was missing, like a missing shoe. She just made herself into something different. And Sylvie says something better. And he says, different, what she wanted to be. And
Hmm.
this is in a way Dylan explaining, who he is. Like he invented himself.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
anything else?
Somebody said, it may have been Dylan, I want to be a musician who eats. In
Yeah,
other words, successful enough that you can make a living, which was always that's always a struggle with artists in the United States and elsewhere.
let's see. Oh, my favorite line was when they were talking about how Sylvie is complaining that she doesn't really know him. And he says, people make up their past, Sylvie. They remember what they want, and they forget the rest. And she says, I've told you everything. My folks, my sister, the street I grew up on. And Bob says, I never asked about any of it. And I bet he didn't, you know.
Yeah, I know, but
Like,
that's a good point about remembering what you want
yeah.
and
Yeah.
blotting out what you don't want to remember. And those that can't blot it out end up in therapy.
um, and he says, everyone asks where these songs come from, Sylvie, but then you watch their faces and they're not asking about where the songs come from. They're asking why the songs didn't come to them.
Yeah, you found a lot of good ones by looking at the script because I couldn't remember them because I was sitting in the theater.
I know. And I'm just going to give you a couple more.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is the thing that you were talking about with Pete Seeger. He says, some people like being asleep. Folk music tells stories about real people, working people all over the world, their struggles, heartbreaks. It isn't dressed up, sugar coated, and packaged up like Rice Krispies. And Bob says, no snap, crackle, or pop. And Pete says, a good song doesn't need frills to do the job. Drums,
Yeah,
electrified guitars. I mean,
yeah,
and you could tell that Dylan's not buying any of that.
yeah. That's the philosophy.
One more. Let's see. Sylvie Russo talking about folk music in the early 1960s. She says, I mean, there's a civil war going on down south, the biggest military buildup in history, nuclear bombs hanging over us. It's not all about the Dust Bowl and Johnny Appleseed anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, what do you think the relevance or is to politics and society today? I mean, this is obviously a contemporary movie, so it's a complicated question. But so what do you know?
Well, I think popular music in general has lost its social commentary edge. I mean, who is the Dylan of today? Maybe some of the black rappers talking about race,
Right.
but now it's mainly just how awful the guy that just broke up with me is, or just idiotic virtue signaling from pop stars rather than any penetrating or insightful, artful social criticism. And that's okay in depending what you're looking for. There's nothing wrong with pop music just being entertaining. But I don't think we have Dylan's today, really.
No, we
And
don't. And you actually make a very good point about the musicians because they actually do some social commentary, but I'm sure I certainly don't listen to that music, and I bet you don't either.
yeah, and
But
some of it's not just folkies either that like Dylan that went deep. I mean, the Beatles had a number of songs, not all of them, that dealt with various issues, either directly or indirectly. Somebody like Ray Davies of the Kinks had a lot of social commentary about what life was like in the class system in England. So there was a lot of really good, insightful, and yet still enjoyable and entertaining music in that era. I just wonder where it is today.
yeah, and I don't want to say that artists should not speak up about issues that matter to them, but I think you have to be very strategic about it. Harry Belafonte fighting for civil rights is one thing. Taylor Swift telling people who to vote for as senator from Tennessee is a different matter.
Yeah,
You know, the principle of diminishing returns matters here. And also, there's a difference between talking about social politics and political politics.
yeah,
You got to be really careful because sometimes you really turn people off, and it's non-productive. So, talking about the class system is one thing. But talking about, I don't know, uh, whatever the issue du jour
yeah.
is
I think there's a huge difference between bringing a some kind of an interesting perspective, whether I agree with it or not, on something going on in society, and who should I choose in my binary choice for an elected office? I mean,
right.
it's totally different. And I think the first is definitely the role for art. And the second is like, what do they know that I don't know?
Right, right.
You
Well,
know, so
almost all these
all
people, none of them went to college or anything, and they don't have
yeah.
time to. I'm sure they don't pore over the Wall Street Journal and New York Times every day, and
Right.
Politico, and everything else to try and get themselves involved in movies. I mean, a guy like George Clooney does, but I'm not sure that he's all that effective either. Although he did kind of bounce out Joe Biden from being president by writing an op-ed in the New York Times. So
Yeah,
sometimes they can be effective, but most often
yeah.
they're not. This is the point where we usually ask, could this movie be made today? Which is obviously you can't ask because it was just made. But I hope this movie shows that movies like this can be popular. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure movie has made a lot of money, and it's probably going to make more money once it goes on to streaming, even though it didn't win any Oscars.
It's
But
probably made some more money for Bob Dylan.
I'm sure it made a lot of money for Bob Dylan because I've been
Streaming
doing
and
my
all
deep
that.
dive. Yes.
Yeah. I think an interesting twist on our customary question of could it be made today is this film covers a star and events from 60 years ago. Well, who are the truly memorable pop culture figures and musicians today about whom they will be making movies 60 years from now, which will be 2085.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's hard to imagine that there's anybody, but we'll check on it. We'll keep the audience updated when we do our podcast in 2085. I wonder if that's ever going to be possible because the distribution of culture and information is so diffuse and self-selected now. And so when you've got three TV networks and AM radio that most people listen to, and a certain number of albums coming out in a very specific method of distribution, with titans in the film studios and titans in the record industry, um, you know, someone either makes it in that system or they don't make it. Today, there's so many niches that who's going to really have domineering, lasting impact, I think is a big question.
so if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
No, it's time stamping of serious issues isn't broad enough to contain enough lessons about the history. Maybe in a college musicology course, getting into the whole, history of popular music and whatnot. That's how I would put it.
If I were teaching a course about the 1960s, I would assign this, because it does depict, well, anyway, I think it depicts what it was like back then,
Atmospherically, but I don't know about
atmospherically.
issues.
All right. And what's the grade? What do you give the grade?
I give it a B plus. It was well acted. It holds the interest. It evokes a certain time period well, um, but it just misses out barely on greatness for me. It penetrates neither the music scene nor the cultural changes deeply enough to be great. But I'd recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, I'd give it an A minus, which is, I guess, just a little bit better than yours. Again, I saw it twice. I saw it once because I wanted to see it immediately, and then I saw it a second time when I knew we were going to do this, so I paid closer attention. I was not bored at all the second time, and again, it's had a big impact on my appreciation of Bob Dylan. So,
Good.
okay, well, this wraps up another podcast. I would say that again, to repeat, this podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. Please subscribe there. It's also available on YouTube for those of you who don't want to listen to a podcast on a podcast platform. If you have comments, email them to me at garyholmes76@gmail.com or on Twitter at Gary Holmes. Jim, would you be so kind as to tell the fine folks who are still listening, what our next movie is going to be?
Well, we're going to do The Apprentice, which is the movie about a younger Donald Trump. And we are doing a full stop at 2015. So if anybody's coming looking to see, wants any acts on any side ground, they're not going to be satisfied. But we felt that the movie would be an interesting one to take a look at because this is the celluloid president. And because we've done other movies that explore earlier phases of future presidents' lives and careers. Is that fair?
That's fair. It's the origin story of Donald Trump, and it has nothing to do with politics per se, but it does have to do with how he became Trump. And two of the actors received Academy Award nominations.
Yeah, yeah. So
neither of them won, of course. Okay, so with that in mind, we'll see you later. And thanks, Jim. I'll see you later.
take care.
Bye.
If you're traveling in the North Country Fair.
I see no one wants to hear what a kid wrote last month.
Well, I like your songs.
Where the winds hit heavy on the borderline.
Who wrote this?
He did.
Remember me. How about that Joan Baez, folks?
She's pretty. Sings pretty. Maybe a little too pretty. Your songs are like an oil painting at the dentist's office.
You're kind of an asshole, Bob.